This is Macro Voices with hedge fund manager Eric Townsend, the free weekly financial podcast targeting professional finance, high net worth individuals, family offices, and other sophisticated investors. Macro Voices is all about the brightest minds in the world of finance and macroeconomics telling it like it is, bullish or bearish, no holds barred. Now, here are your hosts, Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
Macro Voices episode 175 was recorded on July 11th, 2019. I'm Eric Townsend. This episode of Macro Voices is brought to you by TopTradersUnplugged.com, the leading podcast when it comes to systematic trading and investing. Former hedge fund manager Jesse Felder returns as this week's feature interview guest. We'll discuss the stock market, bond yields, gold's breakout, and Jesse's concerns about surveillance capitalism and Facebook's Libra digital currency. Be sure to stay tuned for our post-game segment after the feature interview, when we'll have extended equity market coverage with another of Patrick's famous chart books.
And I'm Patrick Ceresna. Now, Eric, let's dive right into this S&P 500 making all-time new highs. What's going on?
Well, I have very low directional conviction at this point, Patrick. We're seeing such clear evidence that what's in control here is what I call the bad is the new good doctrine. The reason that the S&P ripped vertically higher to new all-time highs on Wednesday morning was because the Federal Reserve Chairman said very clearly that the economic outlook is getting worse. And, of course, the mechanism is easy to understand here. People anticipate that a worsening economic outlook means that there's going to be more accommodative monetary policy, and they know that this market actually operates on liquidity, not economic fundamentals. If there's more injection of stimulus, that money's got to go somewhere. It'll go into asset markets because that's the crazy way that everything has been working since 2009. So I completely understand the mechanism. I think that people, it amazes me, Patrick, that so few people are able to step back and see the really big picture. Why does this giant casino we call the stock market, why is it allowed to exist in the first place? How does it benefit society? The answer is supposed to be that it enables the efficient formation of capital to grow and expand businesses, create employment, and so forth. And, the thing is that when you completely jury-rig the market so it's entirely driven by liquidity and those economic fundamentals, the whole purpose of having the market is so that free market decision-making can determine the allocation of capital most efficiently. We're not allocating capital efficiently. We've got a casino, which is basically a gaming system that is now completely beholden to central bank policy, and it's driven by things that are not the right things. Now, I'm not saying it can't continue. If there's anything I've learned from watching this market over the last few years, it's the fact that we seem pretty darn clearly headed for a recession, the fact that Chairman Powell has confirmed that by saying that the economic outlook is getting dimmer, his words. It just makes the market go higher. And, I know this can't go on forever. Someday reality has to kick in, but it doesn't have to happen right now, and I don't know how much higher it can go. So, Danielle DiMartino Booth says the U.S. is not immune to the global slowdown that's occurring around the globe. Well, I agree with her that the U.S. economy is not immune, and I think the U.S. economy is nearly certain to fall into recession by the end of 2020, if not much sooner. But the thing is, the stock market is not functioning as a leading economic indicator the way it once did. So the fact that I think the economy is headed for recession doesn't necessarily make me think that the stock market has to move sharply downward. I think it's entirely possible that the crazy logic that's been prevailing for the last several years will continue for a while longer. And that crazy logic says the worse it gets, the more the Fed is accommodative, and the more that pumps money into markets which can be used to bid up asset prices. This makes no sense, and it just astonishes me, Patrick, that so few people recognize the total absurdity of it. But I don't see any reason that we should expect it to end right away. So I'm on the sidelines.
All right, well, let's move on to the U.S. dollars. I find it fascinating that at least I saw a headline out there that was saying that, Donald Trump being frustrated with the strength of the dollar. And it seems like every time that dollar has a dip, it's so quick to come back. I mean, we're more or less around that 97 handle right now. What's your thinking here on the dollar?
Well, Patrick, I see more reasons to be bullish on the dollar this week, not less, even though quite a few other people are saying, okay, this is it, the dollar's crashing. They seem to keep saying the same thing every time we get a little bit of a dovish policy indication from the government. And frankly, I think that it is a fallacy that dovish policy has to lead to a lower U.S. dollar. What really leads to a lower U.S. dollar is a change not just in U.S. interest rates, but in interest rate differentials relative to other sovereign credits. And I think that for everything that the Fed is doing dovish, that we can expect the ECB to be at least as dovish. So I think that a lot of this is misplaced. As far as going to the technicals, the one thing that has been a little bit of a concern for me for the last couple of weeks, I've talked about it on the program, is as much as I think we're headed higher on the dollar index, boy, that chart was starting to look like maybe a downward sloping price channel was forming. And I said, watch out. You get to about, 96.50, 96.55 in there somewhere. And if we start to see it roll over there, we really could be looking at that channel. What we saw instead, Patrick, was a decisive breakout above 97 on the dollar index, very clearly breaking that what would have been a channel resistance line. And then when we got another dovish policy message from the Fed this week, everybody starts screaming, oh boy, the dollar's crashing. And I just thought to myself, okay, this is such a classic setup. What we're going to see here is we're going to see a knee-jerk down lower to touch that same resistance trend line and now test it as support. So last night, I actually doubled down on my long dollar position, buying at 96.50 on the September contract. Now, I should admit that I actually had a resting limit order that would have been filled at 95.50 a few weeks ago. I chickened out of that because of the gold breakout. The gold breakout really caused me to take pause and think, boy, I need to really carefully rethink my opinion on the dollar. I've carefully rethought it, Patrick. I think we're going higher, and I think what we just saw was that classic retest of a resistance level we just broke through, tested as support. Looks like we're already bouncing off of that line. We'll see what happens, but so far, I wouldn't be surprised if we just move higher. Now, the question is, what is the breakout level that we're watching for? 98 was the number we were watching when the June contract was still the active futures contract. Now that we're into the September contract, there's half of a big point of backwardation. So the high on this contract is right around 97.50, not 98, but 97.50. So if you use what futures traders call the contract high, the contract high was 97.50. But if you look at a continuation chart, which shows what the front month was at the time of each bar on the chart, then the high number to beat is 98. Well, what's the official answer on how that works? In the crude oil market, at least, what everybody does is they just have both lines of their chart because it seems like nobody can decide what the rule is. So I think what we're going to see is that there's resistance at 97.50, and then there's more resistance at 98. And when it's a clear break above 98 on the September contract, I think that's when we're really off to the races. And from there, I think we start to target 104 or so eventually. For now, it's been quite a while. We've been waiting for a breakout. A lot of people think that we're rolling over here and crashing. I don't think so. But I'll also be the first to acknowledge, I've criticized the gold bugs for being too early to claim victory. What I'm seeing here in terms of the things going in my favor in terms of technicals, we still need a little bit more time above these key levels in order to really prove out my point. But so far, I think it really looks good as far as further upside for the dollar.
Eric, I've been dying to ask you about crude oil because a couple weeks ago we rejected off that $60 level, and here we are with that inventory draw that saw this pop now above 60. Is this a breakout, or is this still going to be a false start? What's your thinking?
Well, I think the inventory draw, which everybody's been paying attention to, is only a small part of it. I think that the tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico, which resulted in the evacuation of 15 offshore oil rigs, probably has more to do with the price movement than inventory does. But let's start with inventory. Crude oil drawing down 9.5 million barrels. Super big drawdown that by itself is a very strong bullish signal. Cushing, Oklahoma, drawing down 301,000 barrels. Now, that's not nearly as big, but it is a drawdown in Cushing, whereas previously we had seen a trend of builds, even in weeks that we had a national drawdown. Cushing was building, now Cushing's drawing down. Gasoline drawing down 1.5 million barrels. Distillates was the standout, the single build on the board at 3.7 million barrels. Tape action, I think this is critical, Patrick. It was a pop-up off the 100-day moving average, very briefly kind of violating what might have been a resistance level. And then we very promptly retraced down through the 100-day moving average. And it seemed at first like, okay, this is a pop and drop. We're headed lower. And then the prices really started to take off to the upside about an hour later. I think it was the news of the evacuations of the rigs in the Gulf of Mexico that really drove that next wave higher. Going back to inventory, U.S. production 12.2 million barrels, up 100,000 barrels from last week, still staying right around that same range, very close to the all-time high at 12.4 million barrels. Imports were up to 7.3 million barrels, exports down to 3 million barrels, or 21 million barrels on the week. The tropical storm, I think, was a really big part of this. I had thought previously that we were topping out and the market was maybe ready to roll over toward lower numbers. Now, needless to say, you get a big trend of really huge inventory draws week after week, and you get the evacuation of 15 platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, even though that is a precautionary evacuation, it's not because they think the rigs are going to be lost. It's just to get people out of harm's way as the storm blows through. It still takes production offline for several days, and that's just going to contribute to more drawdowns. So I think it's mostly about that. If we get to the storms blow through, there's no particular damage to the rigs, everybody goes back to work and starts producing oil next week, I think the market probably rolls over at that point. But of course, you also have the possibility of, big storm damage or geopolitical upsets or anything else happening between now and then. So I'm completely on the sidelines. I think that there is an argument for a bearish view, but boy, we got to see that trend of big drawdowns abate before I'm going to get too excited about shorting this market.
All right, well, let's move on to gold because it seems to be holding the 1400 line pretty well. Every time it looks like we're about to see a little correction and give back this move, the buyers are right there to scoop it back up, and it seems to be holding it up here. What's your take here on the gold price? Are we going higher from here?
Well, clearly, the longer that we stay above 1377, the stronger the case becomes that this is a very historically important breakout that has legs and is headed higher. But at the same time, I think the confirmation signal that would really solidify that is, let's say, a weekly close, not just a daily close, above 1442, which has been the high to date. As long as we continue to consolidate in this range between, let's say, 1377 on the downside and 1442 on the upside, there's still room for this to resolve to the downside. But frankly, as much as I have perhaps been proven wrong here, I have to acknowledge that the preponderance of evidence, I think, at this point is on the bullish side. That will be confirmed when we see first a daily close and then a weekly close above 1442. If I go long, it will be a pairs trade, long the dollar index and gold at the same time, because if gold is going to fail here and actually turn out to be a false breakout and end up going back down below 1300 again, the only way that's going to happen is on a dollar breakout. So if I'm long gold and I'm also long the dollar, I've got a hedge there. And if it turns out that we're moving into that regime that we've predicted for years, which is eventually we get to the gold and the dollar moving up at the same time, then I've got a double win. The scenarios where there's a double loss because gold ends up going down and the dollar goes down at the same time, I don't really see how that could play out.
All right, Eric, let's move on to the 10-year Treasury yields because we've had this huge bond rally and it seems to have held for just forever. And finally, we're seeing yields rising and bonds coming off the top. Is this finally the beginning of that correction we've been waiting for?
It seems to be. We're finally backing up a little. I don't think we've backed up a whole lot at this point. I'm watching carefully, but I haven't bought yet. I did close my long fixed income positions on the 2-year Treasury several weeks ago. Did pretty well there, got lucky and got out just about right at the top. As far as getting back into the 2-year and maybe also getting into a long on the 10-year, I'm watching that. Now, remember that Julian Brigden, who's no slouch, predicted months and months ago that we would see a drop all the way down to 2% and then a reversal much higher in bond yields. So I'm very curious to know how Julian is looking at this. Given my recession outlook, I still tend to think lower yields are to come. But I do want to ask Julian about this. We already taped Julian's interview that's going to be on tomorrow's All-Stars. We didn't cover it there, but next time I get Julian on the program, I want to get an update from him on his view because he's the one person who's had the other argument. Right now, I'm just looking for this pullback to move a little further and an opportunity to get back in the long side of this trade.
Okay, thanks for the update, Eric. So before we move on to this week's featured interview with Jesse Felder, please give us a quick update on your efforts to expand the Macro Voices brand with all the new content we've launched since early May.
We're really excited about the new content, and there's more of it coming your way this weekend. We have Julian Brigden on deck for All Stars tomorrow morning, and then he'll be back along with Juliet DeClercq and Alex Gurevich for another installment of Inside the Investment Committee. So all that is coming your way this weekend. But frankly, we still really need help finding sponsors. To be sure, Top Traders Unplugged has been a fantastic sponsor, and their sponsorship allows us to cover the production expenses for the Thursday night podcast. But we still don't have any sponsorship for the new content, and frankly, the leads that we have are starting to wear thin. So, Patrick, I can't even find words to express our gratitude to the people who have donated in recent weeks. Frankly, Patrick, I would have had to put the brakes on the new content and stop producing some of it by now, but the donations that we've received have saved the day. There's still more new content planned, and I'm really excited about introducing it when the economics allow it. But for now, we're already overextended, and we need to find sponsors just to continue producing the content that we're already producing. Launching new content is going to have to stay on hold until we have revenue to support it.
Now, Eric, some of our listeners have asked why you keep asking for help from the audience to find these sponsors when it seems obvious as an alternative that we would simply call an ad agency to find these sponsors. What's the story there?
Well, that's definitely an option, and it's one that we will soon be forced to resort to if we can't find the right sponsors through our own listener community. But it's full of downsides. The biggest problem is that my strong hope and desire is to find compatible sponsors whose products and services are actually a good fit for our audience. Top Traders Unplugged is a perfect example. Some of our audience has absolutely zero interest in that style of trading, while others in our audience might find it to be even more compelling than the macro approach that we discuss here on Macro Voices. The point is, everyone listening can appreciate that at least for some people in our audience, learning about something like Top Traders Unplugged could be really valuable to them. Now, I already have several ad agencies hounding me, but they want to fill Macro Voices up with screaming announcers pitching vacation condos in Belize and investment schemes involving ostrich farming and all sorts of nonsense that I just don't want littering up our programming. The other problem is that the ad agencies are really aggressive. They start by trying to negotiate a 50-50 revenue split where they keep half the money just for being the middlemen. They try to push for exclusive relationships just to see if you're stupid enough to agree to one. It's a business that has more than its share of shady characters. And I haven't met anyone that I really trust and respect in the ad agency business yet to represent us. So, Patrick, these things translate to an outcome where if we're paying huge commissions to agencies, then we'd have to have twice as much advertising as we would if we found our own sponsors. And what's worse, it would be a much lower quality of advertising. I'm passionately committed to avoiding that if we possibly can, and that's why we're holding out for our listener community to help us make connections with companies that would make good sponsors who our audience would actually appreciate hearing from. We have a sponsor pitch video at macrovoices.com/sponsor info, and the most important thing that anyone listening can do to help us is to first watch that video yourself and then think about who you know in the marketing department of a company that would make a good Macro Voices sponsor and reach out to them. We already have a few listeners helping us in this regard, and I can't thank them enough. But we really need help finding more. We need several strategic sponsors so that we can both pay for the expanded content that we're already producing and then begin introducing even more. And as I said earlier, the donations are the only thing keeping us going in the interim. So I want to again thank everyone who has donated through the donate button at macrovoices.com.
Okay, well, thanks for the update, Eric. This week's featured interview guest is Jesse Felder. Eric, why did we invite Jesse back onto the show this week?
You know, Jesse's been a friend of ours and a friend of the program for a long time. He's a super guy. He's a great interviewer himself in his own podcast. And, you know, he's a guy who's been bearish on the market, or I should say bearish on the economy, as I have been for the last couple of years. And, you know, we both have had the same experience of feeling like, you know, we think we got the economics right. It's just that what's driving the market is liquidity, not economic fundamentals. So with the market at new all-time highs, I thought it was an opportune time to get Jesse back on the program. And this episode of Macro Voices was made possible by TopTradersUnplugged.com. Although I'm a macro investor myself, it's a fact that quant-based hedge funds are dominating the rankings of top-performing managers. These are rules-based strategies that remove human emotions and therefore can be researched and tested. And this year, they're off to a flying start. And there's one podcast that covers this area of finance better than any other, TopTradersUnplugged.com. And right now, Macro Voices listeners can get a free book explaining how these systematic strategies can work for you. Just go to TopTradersUnplugged.com/macro to claim your free copy. Again, that's TopTradersUnplugged.com/macro. Check them out. You'll be glad you did.
Eric's interview with Jesse Felder is coming up as Macro Voices continues right here at macrovoices.com.
And now, with this week's special guest, here's hedge fund manager Eric Townsend.
Joining me now is Jesse Felder, author of the Felder Report, and from time to time, also the producer of an excellent podcast. Jesse, it's been too long. It's great to have you back on the program. Let's start with the stock market. Here we are, much to my surprise at least. Not quite all-time highs today, but within the last several sessions, we've been at all-time highs. I don't know about you, but the economic message of everything's rosy and it makes sense for the stock market to be at all-time highs is not resonating in my mind. How do you see this market?
Yeah, you know, it's actually been, I think, a year since you had me on. And back then, I shared a bunch of charts with your audience showing the breadth divergences and really the number of Hindenburg omens was the thing that really stood out to me. And we had that steep fourth quarter decline kind of right after that last time we talked. I think we're at another similar point right now where stocks are kind of still trickling higher, but valuations are extreme almost no matter how you measure them. And I'm seeing that kind of deterioration under the surface again. We're seeing, you know, Stan Druckenmiller gave an interview recently where he talked about certain subsectors of the stock market are the best economic forecaster he's ever come across. And he specifically mentioned, you know, small caps, retail, transportation, those types of things. And when you look at the relative performance of those sectors, metals and mining was another one. It's horrendous right now. I think small caps recently just hit their lowest relative point to the S&P since the 2009 bottom. So these subsectors are sending a pretty serious message about where the economy stands and also just the overall breadth of the market as it hits these new highs.
We talked about breadth last time we had you on the show. I can't believe it's been a whole year. We need to get you on more frequently. It seems to me like we've got a different kind of breadth now. It's the international breadth issue that, as Danielle DiMartino Booth pointed out recently in one of our All-Stars interviews. Look, the message is really clear. The decline in equity values is already happening and has been happening for a while now, internationally on a global scale. but somehow the U.S. has managed to stay immune. And Danielle's comment is, look, the U.S. can't be immune forever. There's another argument, though, that Brent Johnson has posited, saying, look, what's going on is normally, under normal circumstances, in every little economy, every little market around the world, when the stock market takes a dive to the south side, what happens is people pile into sovereign bonds in their own country. That's their safety trade. The thing is, those markets are deeply negative yielding in a lot of cases, and it doesn't make any sense to pile into those. Brent thinks what's going on is there's this international safety trade that is holding the U.S. market up. What do you think of that theory? Because frankly, Jesse, I don't think you and I were wrong when we thought this market should have topped out a long time ago. But it hasn't, and it seems like it behooves us to figure out what the heck is going on, why it has been so resilient. Do you think Brent's ideas make any sense? And if not, what other ideas do you have that would explain why the market has stayed so high for so long in the face of so many reasons that it shouldn't?
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of Brent and Danielle, both their work. I pay attention to what they write and discuss. But I do think that makes a lot of sense, and I do think that does help to explain it. I think there's been a lot of foreign money that's poured into our markets here in the U.S., just fleeing negative yields. But I think, this probably comes back to the currency discussion. I think you have to be a dollar bull to think that the stock market is going to hold up. I'm not bullish on the dollar, and we can get into that if you like too. But I do think that, yes, if you look at just relative yields, relative returns around the world, there's been this flight out of Japan, out of Europe, out of negative yields, and it's gone into our sovereign bond market here in the United States. It's gone into corporate bonds here. Junk bonds have done really well. I mean, you look at these big Japanese banks buying leveraged loans, as much as they can get their hands on. So yeah, there's been this kind of hunger for any type of yield, but reaching for yield never ends well. And that's exactly what's going on right now is you look at, junk bond yields with, 5-6% nominal face value yields on them is, at a time when there's no covenants on these things and leverage among corporate America is at record highs, it's going to end badly. And so they might think they're getting a positive return today. There's going to be a fleeing out of these assets at some point. My friend Helene Meisler said that her mentor taught her the last people to buy are always dentists and foreigners. And I think that's what's going on in the market. And it's funny to me too, that, when you talk about the U.S. stock market, we've essentially gone nowhere for 18 months. And this is how markets top. They take time to, build kind of a rounding top. Bottoms are a point in time and tops are a process. And I think we're still in the middle of this topping process right now for the U.S. stock market.
Let's move on then and go a little deeper on the U.S. dollar. Lots and lots of fundamental reasons that I can see to be short. In my mind, they've been outweighed by the global dollar squeeze argument. How do you see this whole thing, and what are your views on the dollar?
I think, when you look around, to me, I try and keep it simple in terms of my currency views. And I look around and I see the fiscal situation in Europe, led by Germany, is much, much better than our fiscal situation. We're running a budget deficit of, 5% of GDP right now and growing, $1 trillion plus fiscal deficit. And you look at the kind of the zeitgeist in Washington right now, there's no worry at all about the growing deficit, the growing debt pile. In fact, we have on the Democratic side people talking about forgiving $1.5 trillion of student loans or giving every American $1,000 free every month. We have, these kinds of the policies that are being discussed. And at the same time, a real effort on the part of the Fed to rethink its policies towards inflation in order to stimulate inflation, or at least stimulate inflation expectations. And you have, the president also kind of pushing for that type of policy, weak dollar policy. Everything I look at in terms of macro here in the United States is pointing at a lower dollar. And to me, that when you look at currencies, you look at the dollar, it's very highly correlated to the deficit. The deficit's widening, and the dollar hasn't really responded yet. I mean, it did peak a couple of years ago. We've had that rally so far over the last, 9 months or something. But I do think this is a bear market rally. We haven't made new highs in the dollar index. And I do think, that it needs to catch down to the fiscal situation. So that's kind of my view on the dollar. And if you think about it, it fits well with this move. Japanese investors, European investors have been very comfortable coming and buying our assets and not hedging their currency risk because of the fact that once they hedge, they lose all that pickup in yield. And so they're very exposed that if the dollar does begin to turn south, they don't have that currency hedge on. They're going to have to sell assets and move back into their home currency. So that to me is the trade that's on the horizon. And it's a bearish dollar, bearish U.S. financial assets kind of in total.
Let's talk about bond yields, because as much as it seems like the stock market is not taking the message I think it should be taking and moving lower, the bond yields sure seem to be sending a message that the bond market gets it. What do you make of this divergence, and what do you see on the horizon for bond yields?
The way I view what's going on in the bond market is just a panic into bonds. It's panic buying. Yes, the economy's slowing, but if you look at inflation, I just think it doesn't make any sense. Warren Buffett was talking about this recently, and Charlie Munger. Howard Marks wrote about it recently too, saying that, all of these things together, the worsening fiscal situation and low bond yields and a strong dollar, it's a thing that you can't have all three. Historically, they've not been able to coexist. And so it doesn't look like the fiscal situation is going to change anytime soon. And to me, that suggests that interest rates must be higher. And if you look at the term premium on long-term treasuries right now, it's the lowest in history. So to me, that is the ultimate sentiment signal that investors are willing to accept very little, if nothing at all, in terms of the duration risk that they're taking right now. What I think is, probably the biggest risk for the markets right now is that there was an article in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week where they interviewed a bunch of just retail investors who were, some of these people pouring money into the bond market. And they said, I don't even care what it yields. I just want the hedge against a stock market decline. And I think probably, it's not difficult to imagine a situation where stocks and bonds decline together in a period, a stagflationary environment. And I really do think that's what we're headed for: slowing top line growth, slowing economic growth, and rising inflationary pressures as a result of a number of factors. And that's just, probably the worst possible environment for financial assets, both stocks and bonds.
If both stocks and bonds start selling off together, one of the theories out there, and certainly it's one that I subscribe to, is really we're in almost completely uncharted territory as far as what could happen with an unwind of, there have been times before where bonds and stocks both sold off together, but not in an environment where you have this massive, massive institutional allocation to this risk parity strategy, which basically has to be unwound if that starts to happen. So it seems to me like if there's a recipe for a really, really big, 2008 sized, what's the crisis that nobody saw coming? And of course, there's always somebody who did see it coming. It seems to me like it is the self-reinforcing nature of both bonds and stocks selling off at the same time, resulting in a mechanical unwind of that institutional risk parity trade. Have you done any analysis of that? What do you think of that theory? How much does that resonate for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's all guesswork. Obviously, it's something that I have thought about. I think, risk parity, to its credit, has volatility triggers so that, prevents them from just riding those trades into the ground. And I don't know if this is, stagflation would kind of strike me as less of a kind of a one-time trigger event like the financial crisis, and something more that's maybe just a slow bleed or slow burn, where you just have kind of a longer, more drawn-out bear market in stocks and bonds together, and maybe they don't move perfectly correlated the whole time, but the general trend for both is to the south side. I'm more worried about individual investors who today think that, buying bonds is going to balance out their portfolio. And the only reason they believe that is because over the last 30 years, it's worked that way. But if you look back further in time, you needed to have other assets in there. Financial assets do move in tandem. They're not, stocks and bonds aren't negatively correlated for actually most of history. And so, the risk parity question is really difficult to answer. But I do think that this 10-year period of ultra low volatility and rising asset prices that I've been calling the everything bubble for 2 or 3 years now at least, has really given people incredible confidence in a number of really risky strategies, whether it's, leveraging up bonds through risk parity or, selling put options or volatility targeting, selling, short selling volatility, selling catastrophe insurance. I mean, investors got into buying catastrophe bonds, essentially selling catastrophe insurance. There's just too many of them to count. And, who knows how they're going to unwind. But the history shows that whenever people become way too confident like this, it does end in some type of a painful thing. And really, I do think passive investing in both stocks and bonds, saying I'm going to buy financial assets and I'm going to dominate my portfolio with financial assets, regardless of the price that I pay, is one of those systems, strategies that I think is just built on overconfidence generated by 10 years of wonderful returns.
I know that your personal favorite style of investing is value investing. How do you do that when, by your own description, almost everything is overpriced?
There are good values in the markets to be found. I think one of the stocks that I like right now is Bed Bath & Beyond. The stock trades at 2.5 times free cash flow. It has almost no debt. I think it's $500 million in debt, and they do $750 million in free cash flow every year. So that's a stock that's extremely cheap. The short sellers have gone crazy in this thing. I think roughly 50% of the float is now short. And so if this company just stays in business, it's going to, triple in price. So those are the types of things that I look for to own on the long side, and I sell short other names on the other side to try and ameliorate just general market risk.
So even in your value investing strategy, you're still running a long-short equity interpretation of value investing, where I guess would you consider overpriced stocks that you can short a form of value investing?
Yeah, so I try and pair value with momentum. And so I look for things that are cheap that I want to buy that have waning momentum on the downside. They're typically in downtrends, but I don't want to buy something that has strong downside momentum. I mean, that's the classic, catching a falling knife, things I want to avoid. And, same thing with selling something short. I don't want to short sell something that has strong upside momentum. I want to find something that's, I think NVIDIA last year was a perfect example. I'm still short semiconductors pretty heavily. They're extremely highly valued right now. Momentum has been turning for, just like the broad stock market, for the last 18 months. And so I think the combination of those, and the fundamentals are deteriorating rapidly. I mean, these companies are seeing sales declines 20, 30, 40% year over year, and the stock prices are still holding up. And so investors essentially gambling that this semi-down cycle is going to rapidly reverse itself to the upside, and these insane valuations are going to be justified. But, NVIDIA was a great example last year where it was pretty obvious with the implosion of the crypto markets that mining was going to take a hit, and that was all of their incremental demand for chips. And so NVIDIA was trading at its highest valuation in company history, even higher than it traded in the peak of the dot-com mania. And a lot of it was built on that excess demand that was just evaporating along with the Bitcoin price. And so those are the types of things I look for on the short side. And, I will qualify that by saying I don't put on huge positions on the short side. I use indexes a lot for hedging, and my short positions I keep relatively small compared to what I do on the long side. When I find ideas that I like on the long side, I feel pretty comfortable putting on big size positions. The other factor that I use besides valuation and momentum is insider buying and selling. So when I see insiders buying 3-4 times their annual salary in stock in a company that I see is very cheap, that's something that gets me really interested. When I see insiders on the other side, NVIDIA insiders were selling massively, talking a good game during the quarterly conference calls. And then as soon as the conference calls ends, let's go dump half our shares, 60, 70, 80% of our stake in the company. And that's usually a pretty good sign too, that it's confirming my other ideas about the company.
Let's move on to gold. I have to admit that I was caught off guard by this breakout. I do believe very strongly that as central bankers paint their way into a corner they can't get out of, that gold is going to be the asset to own in the long run. I didn't think we were quite at the point where it was going to be time for gold to take off, but this 1350, 1375 resistance level has been there for 5 solid years. So far, it's been, at least 2 or 3 weeks now that we've sustained a breakout above it. And, we haven't gone super high to the upside. We're not ripping higher, but we're not retracing down lower either. I'm guessing that you probably were bullish before that happened, but what's your take and how has this breakout changed it?
Yeah, I've been really bullish gold since mid-2015. I think when the Wall Street Journal published Jason Zweig's article, and I'm a big fan of Jason. I think he's a brilliant financial thinker, but he wrote an article suggesting that gold was a pet rock. And when that gets highlighted by the Wall Street Journal, the biggest, financial publication in the world, you have a pretty good idea where sentiment stands towards something. And, after it peaked in 2011, 4-year bear market of, created tons of pain. Meb Faber's done research that when you see an asset class decline, whatever it is, 20% a year for 3 years in a row, it's usually a good buy. Gold did that for 4 years in a row into 15, and it became a great buy at, whatever it was, 1,050 back then. And I've been really bullish on the gold price since then. I love the fact that it's, essentially 1,400 now. It's up $350, and people are still skeptical about gold. It's up, 30% plus in the last several years. It's probably, I think it's roughly equal to the stock market over that time. People are extremely bullish stocks and extremely skeptical towards gold. And to me, that those are just wonderful sentiment signals that when the stock market goes nowhere for 18 months and people still bullish, that's kind of what happens early on in a bear market is people don't give up on it until prices really break lower. Same thing with, in an early bull market. The bull market in gold to me feels like 2010, 11 in the stock market when people were still even 12. It wasn't until 2013 when stocks really broke higher. The Russell 2000 broke above a really important resistance level, just like gold did recently, that people started figuring out, okay, now it's time to go buy stocks. And I think that's where we are in gold. Paul Tudor Jones recently said if it breaks above that 1350, 1400, it's going to 1700 pretty quickly. And that's just the technical target that makes sense with that projecting off that rounded base that it's made. And I think the way we get there is from people realizing this desire to create inflation, this desire to create a weaker dollar is something that almost has to happen. It's something that we're seeing in the White House. We're seeing Elizabeth Warren talk about it. We're seeing the Federal Reserve talk about we need to create more inflation. And they're going to do whatever it takes to make it happen. And if they do, the dollar is going to tank and everyone's going to realize we have to have a ton of gold in the portfolio, a significant allocation. Once that realization happens, that's how you get $1,700 gold.
Now, a lot of gold investors are also, at least the speculative gold investors, are also really big on silver. And something that surprised me a little bit is I would have expected that when you saw this very strong technical confirmation signal that says, hey, gold really clearly has caught a bid here, something's going on, I would have expected silver to just be crazy up at that point as all of the really speculative interests said, okay, we got our confirmation, let's pounce on silver. It seems like silver's lagging a little bit. What's going on?
I've thought about this. I think it might just be, like I said, the semiconductor industry is really hurting right now. And, silver does have some industrial applications that people might just be worried that if we are heading into recession, the demand for silver might collapse. And that might be what's holding it back. But it hasn't been this cheap relative to gold since I think the early 90s or something. It's ridiculous how cheap silver is. But then again, you look at the gold mining stocks and they're as cheap, they haven't been this cheap relative to the metal since early 2000s, 2000, 2001, something like that. And so to me, those are all signs. Another sentiment signal I look at for the metals is, there's it used to be the Central Fund of Canada. It's now the Sprott Gold and Silver Trust. It still trades at a discount to its net asset value. And to me, this is amazing because Sprott, when they took it over, announced a conversion feature. They will convert your shares in this closed-end fund to bullion whenever you want. And so there's no reason it should trade at a discount. I'm surprised somebody hasn't just bought up shares and converted just to arbitrage the difference. And so to me, all of those signs, the silver relative to gold, the miners relative to the gold price, these discounts in the closed-end funds still all suggest to me that people really just haven't embraced the bull market yet.
Jesse, I had a conversation recently with Pippa Malmgren about surveillance capitalism and this change that's going on. When Silicon Valley got into the software business with, I guess it was Microsoft and Apple and, Macintosh and Windows and so forth, these things were cool. Everybody liked them. There was no threat that anybody thought was a bad thing about computers, other than maybe young people spent too much time on them and were under-socialized. Now we've gotten to the point where Facebook has material influence over elections in multiple countries. And something that I've become even more concerned with, in fact, I produced a video recently, which is at macrovoices.com for people who only get Macro Voices, by the way, in your iTunes feed. There is more content there. We haven't figured out how to get the video into the iTunes feed. So that's at macrovoices.com on the homepage. But I did a 45-minute video on this subject about digital currency and where it's headed and my concerns about Facebook. You've been writing quite a bit about this subject for years now. We talked a little off the air, and you said you think it's maybe coming to a tipping point. What did you mean by that? What's the tipping point, and what can we expect?
Well, it's interesting. Malcolm Gladwell wrote his book, The Tipping Point, in the early 2000s, really before we had this idea of, things going viral, really before social media and all this. And before network effects and these kinds of things really became, the jargon for the internet industry. And then, you had companies like Facebook and Google, and they really became what they are today because of these network effects and viral spread of information. And I really do think now that this backlash against big tech is going viral, and they are at risk of, these viral effects being as negative for them as they were positive in the beginning. Gladwell in his book says you need three different things to get to a tipping point where something, a trend goes viral. And the first is you need a handful of kind of really insightful and influential people to take up the message. Then you need to have a message that resonates strongly with other people, and then it needs to be spread in an environment that's fertile for that type of a message to gain traction. And I think we have all those things today. We had somebody like Lina Khan who wrote about how Amazon had created such anti-competitive business practices that we really need to rethink the antitrust framework. And now that's being discussed by the Department of Justice, and there are attorney generals, state attorney generals all over the country that are looking into this. And so you had a handful of people like Lena. Roger McNamee was somebody who I interviewed on my podcast, who came out and said, Facebook was maybe my greatest investment ever, but now I'm absolutely frightened at what it's become, and it desperately needs to be regulated. So you have a handful of these people. They're spreading this powerful message that these companies, maybe they're not hurting consumers in terms of raising prices, but they're hurting people in other ways. And they're actually severely and, demonstratively hurting competition within their industries. And so, the third thing is you need this fertile environment. And I do think when you think about what's going on with, populism and why we're seeing these populist uprisings around the world, it's due to wealth and power inequality. And when you look at these companies, they are the poster children for wealth inequality. You look at, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, and the workers in his warehouses are some of the, poorest treated workers in the country. And so the dichotomy there just makes them the perfect target for these sentiments, these sentiments that are the backlash towards wealth inequality and power inequality. So I think all these things are coming together right now. And, we're seeing at the FTC and at the Department of Justice, they're saying, this is not a political issue. This is bipartisan. It's people in both parties and people from all walks of life saying that we need to figure out how to regulate these companies because they're hurting competition. They are potentially the poster children for what's gone wrong with capitalism over the last 10, 15 years too. So I do think this movement, this backlash against big tech is growing, and it has major implications for these companies, and as leaders of our stock market over the last 10 years, has major implications for the stock market too.
It's very interesting. As you were talking there, I couldn't help but think, it seems to me like Malcolm Gladwell maybe left out a fourth bullet point there, which is you've got to have influencers and the various other things that he said. But I think you also have to either not be taking away something that was really cool, or you've got to be providing an alternative to it that's safer and better. And, what I see in this public discussion is there's a lot of people, a lot of people in society who are fighting mad at Google and Facebook because of these things that have come out about how they mine our personal data and use them for reasons and purposes that we never consented to and so forth. And they're just absolutely bitterly angry. But do they stop using social media? No. Why? Because that's what keeps them connected to their friends, and it's really cool. They like it. And I guess what I fear is unless you're going to replace these things and maybe regulating them in a way, I would like to see it resolved through free market enterprise, for somebody else to come along and do a Facebook that comes with promises that they're not going to misbehave the way Facebook does. But it seems like once Facebook is entrenched, it's very hard for someone else to come in and compete with them. So I just wonder, are we really going to expect people, even though they get angry, are they actually going to delete Facebook and close their accounts, or are they going to just gripe about it and keep using it?
That's a really good question. I think we've seen a little bit of both. I saw something this week, I think it was the Telegraph reported, engagement in the UK, Facebook engagement is down 40% in the last year since the Cambridge Analytica scandal. This is why Facebook stopped breaking it out and they started putting it together and reporting WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook together, because I think they're afraid that, yes, the Facebook brand is dying on the vine and people are abandoning that platform. Maybe not everybody, but there's definitely signs that show engagement here in the US and in the UK is down dramatically over the past 12 months. I think one of the things that regulators are talking about doing, which would really be perhaps detrimental to Facebook and Amazon and Google, is to simply just bar them from making any more acquisitions. You look at how important the Instagram acquisition was to Facebook. If they had not bought Instagram for $1 billion, and it's probably worth more than the Facebook platform is today, that would be a completely different company today. And you look at Google, and they've made billions and billions of dollars of acquisitions in just the last 18 months. DoubleClick was an acquisition. These companies, if they were just the original platforms, it was just Google search, it would be a totally different business. Same thing with Amazon. If Amazon were not allowed to go into and buy up competitors, and this is the thing, the real antitrust argument that I think that the regulators have, is that these companies have such a great hold on the data. They can see where their consumers are going. They can see where their users are going. And they can say, wow, there's already a nascent viral shift towards this new platform. We better buy it. And that's what's allowed them to dominate their markets. And so I think if regulators say, we want to really spur competition in these areas, the way to do that is prevent these companies from making any more acquisitions. If they do that, then that potentially better than anybody, Eric, in such a fast changing world as, technology and these things, if you can't keep up, you're going to be left behind. And I think that's something that's already being talked about. And in fact, people are speculating that these companies are already going to, just of their own free will, slow down their acquisition spree just to try and get regulators to not pay so much attention to them. So that's just one area of it, but I think it's a really important one.
I see your point, but it seems to me that mergers and acquisitions also play a very valuable role in growing the economy and growing the efficacy of businesses that do good things. Is there a way to address this with disclosure? I mean, when you apply for credit or something, they have to tell you certain things about how information is being used. It seems to me like what we really need is a law that says anytime anybody on the internet is collecting any information about you, they have to do two things by law. They have to, number one, disclose what it is that they're collecting, even if it was something that was being collected in an unobvious way that you might not have noticed otherwise. And they also have to tell you what they're going to do with the information that they've collected. It seems to me if you had a law about that, compliance with that would be expensive. It would be a burden, and I hate to see businesses burdened with regulatory compliance. But it seems to me that would more directly address the real issues than something like a ban on acquisitions. Is there a downside, or am I missing something, or do you think that wouldn't be practical, or what?
No, I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's probably a combination of these things. And Europe has really tried to lead in this direction with the GDPR legislation, and I think it's probably coming here. There was a great article in the New York Times this week about this very topic, that these companies rely so heavily on data that the only way you're really going to be able to rein them in is by regulating the data. And I agree with that completely. I think we should have the right to tell people to stop tracking us or to delete our data and all those things. But it's really, really difficult to do. There have been ideas about breaking up the companies and separating platforms and data collection from, if you want to be an advertiser, if you want to be selling advertising, you need to separate yourself from the platform. So that would apply to Amazon, Facebook, what have you, that, they have too much power in trying to, create the platform and then also use the data and then sell the advertising to that data. So there's a lot of different ideas there. I don't know where it's going, but I do know that I think we have reached a tipping point. I do think there is going to be regulation coming down the pike. It's probably going to be a combination of all of these things in some way or another. And, if you look at the history of, regulating, trust busting, antitrust history, the sector that's been at the center of it has always gone from being the most powerful and the most profitable in the market to becoming an also-ran within the market. Once Washington turns its eye on a sector in this respect, it usually means the end of the leadership of that sector in the market. So I do think, people need to pay attention to this in terms of their equity portfolios and say, what kind of exposure do we want to have to this right now? And these companies are already beginning to price it in. Google is not extremely overvalued. Amazon probably is. Facebook is, valuation has come in, but everything, depends on what this regulation is going to look like. And if you look at even Microsoft, once they reined it in, the stock didn't do much. And also, the other thing to point out with that episode was that the lawsuit against Microsoft really coincided with the bursting of the dot-com mania. And I really do think this new bipartisan regulation could represent a similar type of catalyst for the broad stock market right now.
Something I thought was very interesting was that as soon as Facebook announced Libra, first of all, the reaction of Congress was kind of unprecedented, I thought. They didn't really cite any authority or, according to the powers vested in us by the such and such act, we ask you to stop doing this. So they just said, look, we don't like this. This is really not cool. Please stop doing it. It seems to me that they're not going to stop doing it. And if anything, I think the message is out that governments are starting to recognize what I've said all along, which is digital currency is going to change the world completely. And it's going to be a question. It's going to be a challenge as to how much control government actually has over it. What do you make of Facebook's Libra currency and some of the other things that are going on in the digital currency space? How do you interpret all of these things?
Yeah, well, I have to say, I loved your conversation with Pippa, and your book informs a lot of my thinking on, when it comes to these things. It's funny every time, I think when Libra was announced, I said, I put out a tweet, said, everybody should go back and listen to my conversation with Eric because it was so relevant to what's going on. I do think that, all the central banks are looking at creating their own digital currencies right now. I think the Bank of China was the last one who came out just yesterday or this morning or something and said that, Libra does pose a risk to, it's a systemic risk to the global financial system. And so there's no way that central banks are going to allow any kind of, currency like this that crosses borders and whatever and kind of completely makes them impotent in terms of their abilities to manage the, financial system. And I do think this is another horrible. I try and think about what's Facebook's thinking here. Obviously, if they could pull it off, it'd make them incredibly powerful in terms of the additional data collection that it would give them. And, it would essentially make them their own central bank. And so to me, they have to realize that in this current environment, in terms of the perception of Facebook, them announcing this right now is like, wait a second, after Cambridge Analytica and all this kind of stuff, you think we're going to trust you to run the world financial system? You got to be crazy. So to me, this really smacks of desperation, that the Facebook platform is dying on the vine, and they need something like this in order to try and save that platform. Otherwise, they would have held off and wait until there's a better environment PR wise for them to come out with something like this. So I think in the end, there's no way the powers that be are going to allow something like this to have its own autonomy over financial transactions and what have you. It's going to be regulated somehow. And more likely, I agree with your idea that central banks are going to come up with their own cross-border digital currency that they're going to be able to keep control of.
That's fascinating, Jesse. We actually disagree pretty strongly on this, and I just want to run my thoughts by you because they've changed I should say they've evolved since I wrote the book. I'd love to get your reactions because I know you do a lot of thinking about this. When the cryptocurrency guys, the Bitcoin maximalists, talk about how Bitcoin's going to change the world and become the new government, replace the U.S. dollar as the center point of the global financial system, I just don't know what these guys are smoking because, as you just said, there's no way governments are going to allow that to happen. And whether the crypto community wants to admit it or not, governments very much are able to stop that from happening. I think what's going on here is I think the Silicon Valley giants, the Googles and the Facebooks are saying, yeah, you know what? There's no way that the crypto guys would ever pull this off, but we could. If we want to create a currency system and use all of the weight of Google or Facebook, these very, very influential large companies, I think they've got a shot at basically beating central banks to the punchline. If central bankers had their act together, they would have benefited from the invention of double spend-proof digital cash, and they would have created their own central bank-issued digital currencies. And yes, we've seen, there was just a conference in Sweden about central bank-issued digital currencies that our friend Steve Keen spoke at, and there's a lot of thinking going on. But I think that Silicon Valley is saying, wait a minute, governments are thinking and acting at government speed. We can act at Silicon Valley speed. We can design a currency system that is so much better that governments can't do anything to stop it. And they won't do it the way the crypto guys did it, trying to intentionally alienate and frustrate law enforcement. They'll take a very different approach that will allow them to be compliant with taxes and so forth. But I think they want to get market share behind a currency system that works so much better than paper money that there's enough public will that it's very hard for central bankers to compete with it. And I think that they have a very real chance of doing that if they're not stopped. And I'm not really sure what could be done to stop them. And I know you haven't seen the video that I have out yet that talks about a lot of this. There may be another one coming behind it. But just based on what I said there, any reactions to that?
I agree with you in terms of I think Silicon Valley thinks that they can accomplish this. Yes, somebody's going to do it. The Bank of China said that the problem with Libra is they still haven't solved they said the code is buggy. It's not going to work. They tested it, and that they still haven't figured out how they're going to process that number of transactions on the blockchain. They think that it's probably not going to be blockchain based entirely because of they still haven't solved that problem. But I do think if you look at the letter that Congress, sent to Facebook, they basically, it was almost a cease and desist. It wasn't technically a cease and desist, but it was basically saying, if you guys move forward with this, we're probably going to have to shut it down while we investigate it. So I just don't think that central banks around the world are ever going to say, we'll allow Mark Zuckerberg to have this kind of power. And I do think they do have the power to shut it down. The other side of it too, that I think about is when I look at this tipping point against big tech, I think most people probably would look at this and go, do I really want to give Mark Zuckerberg that much information about myself and that much power over my funds and what have you? And I do think that the majority of people today, you look at the polls right now that where they're polling trust in Facebook and trust in Instagram and these platforms, the majority of people say, I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg. And, that's probably why he's not branding it Facebook Coin. But at the same time, I think it's a pretty big stretch to get people to see, when with 30-40% drops in engagement on Facebook, to say that they're going to come back to the platform in order to send money is a stretch. If it were a different Silicon Valley company with a different brand, I might see it differently, and they'd have a better chance of succeeding. But with Facebook's brand so tarnished right now, like I said, I really see this as an act of desperation on behalf of the company more than anything else.
Jesse, well, it's really going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out because I really do not want Mark Zuckerberg to be in charge of how money works. I think that's the scariest thing that I've ever heard. And that's what I said in the video, and I may do another video just for central bankers to try to explain some of these concepts to them a little bit better. In any case, we're out of time. I want to touch on what you're doing. The Felder Report is one of the best free newsletters in existence. Tell us about that. But also, you had taken a little hiatus from podcasting for a while. I believe you have resumed the Super Investors podcast series. Tell us what's going on there as well.
Yeah, so the free weekly newsletter I put out is basically, I just do a ton of reading and research every week, and every Saturday I put together the 5 things I found most valuable. Last week I shared your interview with Pippa because I found that so valuable, but that just is a free email that goes out on Saturday mornings. But yeah, I took a little hiatus from the podcast, but I'm at the point where I have some really interesting people I want to talk to. And to me, that's where it comes from. If I get really curious about something, I say, hey, I got to talk to this person. And so I just interviewed Michael Oliver, Momentum Structural Analysis. That podcast is going to come out, I think, this week. And what a brilliant guy. And so I'm just so excited to share his unique methodology with my audience. And I have a couple more lined up, probably going to be on a once a month schedule going forward, just because that's about all I can manage.
And that's all at thefelderreport.com. Jesse, I can't thank you enough for a fantastic interview. Patrick Ceresna and I will be back as Macro Voices continues right here at macrovoices.com.
Macro Voices is a listener-driven program. Please email requests for specific future interview guests to requests@macrovoices.com. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer them on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. We also welcome your suggestions for how we can improve the program. Now, back to your hosts, Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
Eric, it was great to have Jesse back onto the show, and he inspired me for this week's chart book because right off the bat, when he started talking about market breadth and the divergences we're seeing in the markets, I thought it's a great idea for us to put some visuals to this and really kind of go through all of this and see where all those divergences are. So I want to go into that here in just a moment. But before we do, last week we started talking about all the negative yields in Europe, and we were just having a conversation. You wanted to take another dive into this. What's on your mind here this week?
Well, Bloomberg had a piece out this week describing how there are now 14 separate junk bond issues in Europe that are negative yielding. And this, to me, it's just epitomizes the argument that I mentioned at the beginning of the market wrap, which is we are way past crazy in this regime of markets being driven by the way the system is being gamed by central banks, not by economic fundamentals. Just think about how preposterous this notion is that you would have negative yielding, junk-rated debt. So, I've got money. Why would I loan it to a company who gets a lousy credit rating and might not pay it back? Because I've got the opportunity to lose, guaranteed. There's no way to make money on this, but I'm only going to lose a small amount of money for the privilege of being in this bond that is issued by a company that I guess the only way you could possibly make sense of this is the negative yield is perhaps not as deeply negative as the sovereign yield is. But the notion of a guaranteed loss for the sake of buying a bond. And it's a guaranteed loss if you hold it to maturity. If you're speculating on it, the only way you can possibly make money speculating is if that yield goes more deeply negative, if the idea of wanting to loan monies to companies with shaky credit history somehow becomes even more appealing so that more people want to do it at more deeply negative yields. That's the only way a speculator can win in that. So you really have to ask yourself, how is it even possible that markets have gotten here? And the answer at the high level is very simple. It's because markets are being driven by these liquidity influences that don't really have much to do with economic fundamentals. Someday, this whole system has to break and come to an end. And when it does, I don't think it's going to be a pretty picture.
Well, you know, Eric, in Chicago, I'm going to be talking about this because I think that this is just a testament to the financial repression that is actually being pushed through the whole system. And the negative yields is not a decision of what return I'm going to get, but is a function of just the fact that the bond market has been repressed to this magnitude that it's leading to even junk bonds being negative yielding. Anyway, let's move on to this chart deck. Now, for those of our listeners that want to download this, you can find it in your Research Roundup email. Those of you that are not registered for the Roundup email, you can go to macrovoices.com and register your free account and then be able to access the chart book from there. So now, Eric, in the charts, even though I wanted to talk about the market breadth and divergences, you asked me to add this one chart on oil and what's going on in the Permian Basin. What's on your mind here?
Well, Patrick, this chart caught my eye just because it's so visually intuitive, and it makes a point that Art Berman has made on this program and I've made, and it's just to show you the decline rates in shale oil are such that just a couple of years after these rigs go into production, the rate of production declines very steeply. And what this particular graph is showing us so nicely visually is that the amount of shale oil that is currently being produced by shale wells that went into production before January 1st, 2017. That's the whole shale revolution up to 2017. That's less oil production than the new rigs that have been drilled just since January of 2017, which is the orange and the blue color that we see at the top of the graph. And the point is, those are going to decline rapidly, as you can already see the orange doing. The point is, when shale plays out, and when I say plays out, there is a geological argument that at some point we've drilled up the whole country like Swiss cheese and there's not enough resources left that are economic. But there's also the argument of what happens if we get into market conditions where suddenly all of the free-flowing money that has financed shale drilling isn't there anymore. If you're not able to make new shale wells, then the production, which has been the savior of this entire market for the last decade, suddenly collapses very, very quickly. And my point is, I don't think we're there yet. I think oil prices are probably headed lower before they go higher. But when they eventually go higher and we get to the point where we're not adding more shale wells because the sweet spots have already been exploited and the easy money is no longer there, you could get a really, really dramatic price appreciation in oil very, very quickly. We're not there yet, but this chart just really visually shows you why that's coming someday, and it really makes me think about watching that U.S. production number that right now seems to be plateauing just over 12 million barrels. Is it going to continue to grow past its current all-time high at 12.4, or is it going to fall back below 12? The reason I'm watching that so carefully is epitomized by the visual effect you can see on this chart on page 2.
Well, that was really interesting, Eric. So let's move on to the rest of the chart book, because this is where I wanted to talk about these divergences in the markets. And Jesse, during the interview, referenced Stanley Druckenmiller and as well some of the divergences that are occurring in the markets. And I thought we would visualize them and just take a look at what's going on here. And so what I have on just page 3 is the chart of the S&P 500, which, as we can see, is making 52-week and all-time new highs, broken higher. So what I wanted to do is obviously cherry pick the segments of the market that are simply not playing along with the S&P. And where is all this divergence that is happening? And so on page 4 is the industrial index, because a lot of people are referencing a lot of these industrials. And, you know, if you particularly pick on something like a 3M, the chart looks, let's say, far more bearish than the broader industrial index does. But the one thing we can see when looking at the industrial index is that it is not in a position to make 52-week highs immediately. I mean, it's retested those highs, but each high that it's made, even though it's very modest, each high that it's made in 2018 and 2019 is a consecutively lower high. This is far more evident in the Russell. Now, the Russell 2000, which is the small caps, had a pretty strong push in the first half of 2018. But after putting in its summer high of 2018, it was particularly hammered hard during the sell-off at the tail end of the year, and is barely recovered half of the losses that it incurred during that September to December sell-off that we saw in 2018.
Well, Patrick, it definitely begs the question of why the S&P is getting all of the attention. You know, when I think about why that might be, because clearly you're seeing these divergences very clearly here. The Russell's not seeing it. Well, let's think about Brent Johnson's argument for foreigners buying. If foreigners are buying, they're much more likely to buy the S&P, which is the biggest, most well-known index, at least to institutional investors, as opposed to be buying the Russell or something. So it really says to me that maybe Brent's idea that foreign capital flows are what's keeping the S&P levitated might be at play. But let's go ahead and move on to slide number 6 and look at the transports and see what that tells us.
Well, you know, on the transports, actually an interesting little bit of information is that the transport index actually is older than the Dow Jones index. Charles Dow and Edward Jones, when they were putting together these indices, even a decade earlier, put together transport index, obviously to follow the rail stocks back then. But this is the longest standing indice in the world. And the transport index, obviously today has these 30 transport stocks that is a mix of rails and all, the whole mix of them all. It also has been substantially divergent from this. I mean, we're nowhere near the 2018 highs, and even not even close to clearing those March, April, May highs that were put in earlier this year. The transports continue to be a major laggard. All right, so moving on to slide 7, what I wanted to just show is how huge of a laggard even the regional banks have been. The regional banks have barely recovered even half of the losses from that 2018 plunge. And so, you know, the meat of the U.S. stock market, all of the plumbing down below, simply is not participating the way that you see with those mega large caps that are continuing to drive this rally. But then when you go to the heart of some of those transport sectors, such as, let's say, the airlines, the airline sector has just been nothing but just sideways chop for 2 years straight. And then if you let's say move on to chart 9 and you're looking at the global auto index, all of these auto stocks have just been devastated. And not only have they not recovered like some of the others, they're actually a stone's throw away from their 52-week lows. So this idea that there's a recession being led by these kind of autos and rails and things like this makes a lot of sense. And finally, what I want to do is just take a look at that metals and mining ETF, which is the XME. And again, very similar to the autos, this thing is not only not recovered from the 2018 carnage, but similarly is sitting near its 52-week lows, just about to tip over, like if it's got another leg lower coming. And so when you look outside of those technology names and those really large cap consumer staple and discretionary names that have truly been running the S&P 500 higher, these kind of core sectors within the market are showing very little sign of participating in the upside of the market.
Okay, Patrick. Clearly, what we see comparing the S&P to all of these other charts you've presented is there seems to be a good argument that there's really some breadth issues and divergence between the most popular index and the rest of the market. What other measures can we look at to try to get our heads around this besides just looking at other charts?
Right. So this is where I wanted to look at two more breadth indicators. They're actually very similar in their nature. One, it looks at the percentage of stocks that are above their 50-day moving averages, and the other looks at the percentage of stocks above their 200-day moving averages. Now, normally these are just looked at just in isolation to just see to get a sense of whether the market is overbought or oversold. But I wanted to actually look at the divergence between two sets of data points. The first one, the black line on chart 11, which is the percentage of stocks above their 50-day moving average. Just to clarify for our listeners, what this is doing is taking the 500 stocks in the S&P 500 and asking a simple question. Of these 500 stocks, what percentage of them are trading above their 50-day moving average? And it's a simple thing. It's an oscillator that oscillates between 0 and 100%. And right now, the S&P 500 is at 80%. And that's actually something you'd expect at a market that is making 52-week highs, that we're somewhere definitely in top quartile on this indicator. But what's interesting is I overlaid the percentage of stocks above their 50-day moving average for the entire New York Stock Exchange. So rather than just the 500 stocks that make up the S&P 500, now we're talking broadly all of the stocks that make up the NYSE. And that is sitting down well under 60%. And so we have a scenario where it really demonstrates the fact that when you broaden the stock market outside the S&P 500, there is more and more stocks that are simply not participating. This is really just a focus on a core group of those large cap names that are driving all this. And, some contributors to that, people can make an argument that it's the share buybacks and other things that are going on in the S&P 500 that are contributors. Sure it is, but really what we're trying to do with these charts is simply demonstrate the divergence once you look under the hood and look at the internals in the market. So when we move on to page 12 and we're looking at the percentage of stocks that are above their 200-day moving averages. What I thought was interesting here was that, like expected, the S&P 500 is like over 70% of their stocks above their 200-day moving average. But when we move to the New York Stock Exchange, it's barely above 50%. That means that only 1 out of every 2 stocks on the NYSE are above their 200-day moving averages. And that makes me kind of go, right? You would think that maybe that's what happens in late stage business cycle when you have a blow off of the stock market. It's not, I guess, not a healthy broad rally. It's really, like the equivalent in the 70s of the Nifty 50 that would kind of drive the whole stock market and the perception that the stock market is doing well, but the breadth is just awful, right?
Well, Patrick, you mentioned in passing buybacks. I think they're probably a critical part of this. Now, I should be careful because I am not an expert on financing of buyback transactions. But off the top of my head, I would guess that it's a lot easier for the CEO of an S&P 500 company to get financing through the junk bond market to do a massive share buyback. It's going to be easier for the S&P 500 CEO than it is going to be for the Russell 2000 CEO to make that same transaction happen with his investment bankers. It seems like the story here is if you're in that exclusive club called the S&P 500, you've got access to capital for buybacks, and you've probably got more attention from international investors that are looking to buy the most liquid and widely used index. It all seems like it's a recipe to say the S&P gets favorable treatment. Now, the question that really evokes in my mind, Patrick, is, okay, is it set to continue? Because as Brent Johnson thinks, the foreigners are going to keep on buying the S&P, especially if the dollar starts to appreciate? Or is it one of those cases where the breadth is really telling us that the S&P is about to give out and catch down to the rest of the market? I could make the case either way, and normally I would favor the latter case. It makes more logical sense to me. Frankly, things that make logical sense haven't been working in this market recently. So as far as I'm concerned, the jury is out. So I don't see any certain conclusion here, Patrick, on slide 12. But if I move on to slide 13, we do have a certain conclusion, which is our listeners who want to meet you and our good friend Kevin Muir and watch Kevin kick your tail in a debate can go to Chicago for Traders Expo, July 21 through 23rd. Tell us what's going on there.
Well, right. It's I can't believe it's already just one weekend away. But on Sunday, July 21st, it's free to attend. It's at the Chicago Trader Expo. John Netto is going to moderate a bull-bear debate between Kevin and myself. And while we're going to talk about stocks in it, it's really, I think the meat of it is he's a legitimate bond bear. And I tend to have a much more bullish outlook on bonds than he does. And we're going to do a smackdown. And it's it's going to be a really interesting showdown. A lot of my narrative is built around the continuation of the financial repression we've seen, that it's just going to continue. And I'm going to explain my whole case during that session. So anyone who wants to join us, it's free to attend. But the best part is after listening to that session, first of all, John Netto is running that whole Global Macro Edge event during the Sunday morning. And afterwards, we're all heading for a meetup at the bar over there at the Public House on State Street. We're going to meet up around 2 p.m. and we're going to hopefully meet up with all of our listeners. It's free to attend. Anyone who comes out can join us. We're going to have a pint to drink, and it's just going to be an opportunity to meet so many of our listeners and get feedback. So I'm looking forward to meeting any of you that can make it out.
So we should organize an online poll for who won the debate, and the loser of the debate buys the beer for everybody. Sound like a deal?
No. You know what? That sounds like a plan. I'm in. No.
Oh boy!
I plan on winning, so that's going to make it easy. I'll have to find out whether Kevin agrees to that, right?
We'll have to hit Kevin up and see what happens. I wish I could be there myself. In any event, we're going to have to leave it there this week, folks. Today's episode was made possible by Top Traders Unplugged. Don't forget to go to toptradersunplugged.com/macro to claim your free book and subscribe to their podcast as well. For information on sponsoring Macro Voices, please visit macrovoices.com/sponsor info. And, of course, don't forget to register your free account at macrovoices.com. The benefit to you is you'll receive our free Research Roundup email, which will provide you with download links for our content as well as all of the best free research that we could find on the Internet each week. Patrick, tell them what they can expect to find in this week's Research Roundup.
All right, this week you're going to find the transcript for today's interview as well as a link to the charts we discussed in the postgame. There's also an interesting article from Lakshman Achuthan, which is talking about the myth of the tight labor markets. I thought it was really interesting as well. There's an interesting article on what will an earnings recession do to stocks. And, you know, since this is potentially this earnings cycle going to be the second quarter of contracting earnings, it's going to be really interesting to see what impacts has on stocks. And it was a really interesting piece on all of that. So you'll find this and so much more in this week's Research Roundup. That does it for this week's episode. We appreciate all the feedback and support we get from our listeners. And we're always looking for suggestions on how we can make the program even better. Now, for those of our listeners that write or blog about the markets and would like to share that content with our listeners, send us an email at researchroundup@macrovoices.com or tag it with the MVRR hashtag on Twitter, and we'll include it in our weekly distributions. If you have not already, follow our main Twitter account at Macro Voices for all the most recent updates and releases. You can also follow Eric on Twitter at Eric S. Townsend and myself at Patrick Ceresna. On behalf of Eric Townsend and myself, thank you for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
That concludes this edition of Macro Voices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. Macro Voices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com, the Internet's premier source of online education for traders. Please visit BigPictureTrading.com for more information. Please register your free account at macrovoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the Internet each week. You'll also gain access to our free listener discussion forums and research library. And the more registered users we have, the more we'll be able to recruit high-profile feature interview guests for future programs. So please register your free account today at macrovoices.com if you haven't already. You can subscribe to Macro Voices on iTunes to have Macro Voices automatically delivered to your mobile device each week free of charge. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer your questions on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. Macro Voices is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Macro Voices should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Macro Voices are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or sponsors. Macro Voices, its producers, sponsors, and hosts Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna shall not be liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on information or viewpoints presented on Macro Voices. Macro Voices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com and by funding from Fourth Turning Capital Management, LLC. For more information, visit macrovoices.com.